Hi, my name is Mitch, and as a gamer since '96, I have started but not finished so many video games it's almost worth talking about. I had to make the curtain blue because I'm green. One of the things that bothers me about the start of a game is that despite it being the most played portion, it tends to be the least refined. There's often this tendency to start the player off in a wagon, or a boat, or a truck, or a submarine, or a car for world-building purposes. Walking around talking to people, or walking around looking at stuff, or just walking? Don't put me right in the game, coach. Give me lengthy, unskippable dialogue. These weird, specific input non-mechanics, set pieces that don't actually affect me, and condescending over-explanations.
Use the up directional button, the down directional button, the left directional button, and the right.
This could be because game design is an iterative hellscape of our own creation that leads to the beginning of the game being made last, giving the developers the least amount of time to refine it. I feel you on that one. It could also be the fear that players won't stick around without constant hand-holding, and let's call it a misunderstanding of the audience that may even be perceived as disdain or disrespect. But that's none of my business. Burnt my tongue. Part of this is the belief that there needs to be a tutorial level by name.
Seems you'll need a bit of a tutorial.
One that is completely separated from the main game, as if it were shoehorned in as an afterthought. Sometimes this works really well, like Age of Empires 2 with its modular training levels with slick videos at the start, or Call of Duty 4, which actually recommends the game's difficulty based on how well you completed this course. Other times it ends up like Doom Eternal, a phenomenal game about movement that completely stops the player to explain that you must do this and only this. And even teleports them away to a mini tutorial room, and gosh darn it if it doesn't seriously discourage the player from turning this off. There are oodles and oodles of approaches, many of which I'm about to lay out in an analytical fashion, but I am totally aware that these are still opinions from the perspective of someone who has arguably played too many video games. And with that said, Crackdown 2 may have the worst tutorial I have ever played. This tutorial has everything I could have not asked for. An unskippable cutscene at the start, unnecessary exposition about the UI, obnoxious camera calibration, the inability to control the character until they specifically say so, and flashing objective text. Then they put the player in a car and don't let them drive it so they can pick them up in a helicopter. I take it back, I want the Skyrim cart. Heck, I'll take the boat. And that was a pretty obnoxious boat. This video is not about how games are bad for how they teach. They might be bad, just not for that reason. This video is intended to highlight a whole spread of intuitive organic conveyance methods, and I think you're really gonna watch it. Teaching a player how to play your game is as important as the game's design itself. Rules aren't just part of the game, they are game. Without rules, it becomes an interactable experience, not that that's a bad thing. And without the knowledge of these rules, the player may make the understandable conclusion that this is just a bad game, which again is not because of its teaching methods, or that there's a button that does this. I don't even know what to say to that. Teaching the player is not an easy feat. You have to take years of development and an uncomfortable familiarity with the product, and then somehow figure out how a new person in potentially the widest possible demographic will see it. If you've ever had a hard time explaining a board game to someone, then you know exactly what I'm talking about.
We need to exchange steel and wood for more wood, but you can't get any wood unless you have the magical feather, in which case you do that in reverse.
This is because the context of a game's rules in general are usually best learned by playing through rather than explaining them all up front. You have to ease the player into the experience. Or not at all, that's also what the video is about. Most of this video is about conveyance, a general expression that refers to methods of teaching the player without explicitly saying anything. This could be through visual and audio cues, an understanding of human psychology, or existing gaming conventions. Some developers understand this idea so well that they actually make a game about how poorly other games do it. And then there's games that appear to parody tutorials.
You should be familiar with the left and right controls now!
But then become the tutorial they're making fun of.
Use the left stick to move. Use the right stick to press the X and B button while holding RB to try hitting a coconut.
Now you're probably wondering, are you a frog? And why? Also, are you wearing any clothes? And these are all great questions. It is important to know that no part of these ideas are new, as back in the arcade days, games had to instantly convey what was going on. What am I driving? What am I flying? Does this game have big money? Big prizes? I love it! And while video games may be new to our species, games themselves are ancient. Humans have been playing games for a really long time, as they are a great way to hone our mental and physical acuity while staving off boredom with our retired bros. Chess may not be actual battle, but it serves as a mental training ground for the real thing. Oh, I hope it has the green felt on the Video games are the natural progression of this idea, serving as a wonderful outlet to replace our insatiable bloodlust, and to sell microtransactions to children that will probably grow up with a skewed sense of the reality of war. But anyway, as we moved from the dynasty of to the dynasty of games had to get crafty with their explanations as gameplay was becoming more complex with advanced 3D graphics and mechanics that went beyond jump and shoot the devil. This explosion of complexity and variety led to as many ways to communicate to the player as there are games. Some games slap the player with waves of information, while others bury their training tracks under a mountain of content and behind a subscription paywall. What company would do that? The best way for most games is probably gonna land somewhere in between these. Personally, I prefer the vertical slice approach, where the player is given a sense of what they'll experience throughout the game, wrapped up nice and neat with a spike through its chest. But it isn't that simple, as games come in many shapes and sizes, and their methods of conveying information should match. Tunic is presented with a very simple aesthetic, and it's all about exploration. So they open the game up right away and let the player explore, occasionally throwing them a really well-drawn instructional leaflet. Agent Under Fire says, "Hey, look at this," and then removes these shots on higher difficulties for returning or expert players. Doom 2 explains very little while casually establishing the weapon meta for all shooters for decades, and The Messenger relies heavily on commonly used game mechanics that can be applied broadly. And if you'd like to support me broadly, Patreon? Most games before the video and board kind would have their rules passed on through oral tradition, which I'm sure, but can't prove this, probably led to some of the rules and intentions being lost over time. But video game designers get to package their game with the rules built in, allowing them to get a little bit wooey-quazy with their ideas. Rather than standing next to their creations to be like, okay, so this guy's a boss fight, but he's actually not intended to be beaten until later, but you can, but we put him here to make you feel helpless, so that when you came back and then you fight them, you're like, oh, I can do this. Instead, they have the opportunity to find clever ways to convey this information through the gameplay. Or not at all, that's also what the video's about. But what if there was a universal, one-size-fits-all approach to game design that could be applied to any game type for any demographic, regardless of game familiarity? There isn't. No. But I think we can get pretty close with a combination of many ideas from many games I've been calling learning through gameplay. Now, some things are easy to teach. Jump, crouch, bombs. These aren't secrets. Put the player in a situation where they have to use the mechanic and away you go. But I'd like to focus on a game with a little more complexity in its mechanics and its methods of teaching them. Dead Space 2 by Visceral Games demonstrates many of the ideas I've brought up so far and more, all while being quite scary and icky and excellent. But what I really want to focus on is its teaching strategy, learning through gameplay. The video's about Dead Space 2 now. Visceral Games puts you into the very cool metal shoes of Isaac Clarke, a man who is not above punching the heads off of children, and I wish people would stop saying that he is. While indie titles are quite good at things like conveyance, big budget games seem to have a much harder time with it. But this game, for all its faults, uses a series of organic tutorial methods that bank on the player's interest in learning, often adapting to them on the fly. And very, gross. I thought it would taste better. Typically, developers like to start the game by giving the player a chance to feel the gameplay, free of any additional conflicts, quite often in baby steps to avoid overwhelming the player. Dead Space 2 does this by overwhelming the player with its wacky horror introduction, but underwhelms them by binding Isaac's arms so it's clear their only focus should be on running, which is reinforced by the button prompt also being their objective. Run! Now I could spend time on how some games make all the basic movement functions available right off the goat, and whether constricting the player to one thing at a time is a good or bad idea, but I'd rather talk about button prompts. I don't know what that is. It just keeps doing that. While we could meme on them all day, thank you, and I do encourage that.
Jason!
Button prompts are the simplest, most effective strategy to teach with the context of gameplay without stopping the action. Unfortunately, the button prompts drunken uncle, the stop everything you're doing and read this approach, loves to just barge in at any moment, completely ruining all the momentum. But it's unlikely this approach will ever go away, as it's simply too easy and allows developers to add info in late in development. When done correctly, button prompts inform new players while remaining relevant to expert or returning ones. Bonus points for prompts that change on the fly when you change control styles, and ones that go away when you press said button. Ooh, and the ones that stay still. I like those a lot. They can also be used to highlight interactable elements. Oh hey, I can pick up this cheeseburger. A round of applause for button prompt designers. Dead Space 2 takes this to a more realistic level with its diegetic interface, which basically means it exists in the game's world, like a weapons ammo count, Isaac's health bar, or the fact that you would actually be saying After some exploration of the space station, Isaac falls into a room where a man is being suspended by kinesis, an ability that utilizes parts from enemies and nearby objects that serves as a very important part of the game's meta. Now, most high-end devs like to give the player a safe environment to teach new mechanics. Maybe there's no enemies here or stuff inside they can use the new mechanic on. They did that here, but they also added the context of what kinesis is before they get to use it. The player can't leave this room without using kinesis, as Isaac the engineer doesn't do jumping. They can mess around with his new ability all they want, but unbeknownst to them, the moment they blast open the way forward, two necromorphs will burst into the room. Rather than holding the player still in slow motion, Visceral makes the player acknowledge their understanding with the same move that initiates a practical test of that understanding. The player is not told how to solve this problem, but the setup of this medical theater does give them plenty of time to prepare themselves. In the next room, and I don't exactly know if this was intended, but they spread out the objects the player can use, so it's likely they'll discover you can pull the spikes off of dead guys? Oh yeah! At this point, the player might be getting a little too used to this handcrafted tutorial design, so they give the player the prompt for stomping corpses. The stomp prompt, if you will. And I will. This puts the player in a situation where they have to get up close and personal with corpses that aren't corpses. I really like this. It's sort of like a giant ball you couldn't have known about, or overwhelming the player in a roguelite to make them die for the first time. It's a healthy dose of unfairness, experienced, not explained, and definitely not shown in a cutscene where the player has no agency. It's not as simple as showing the player is good. Sometimes it's what the player is not told that really makes the experience. When players discover the shop in Spelunky 2, the game doesn't tell them that they can steal the shotgun and kill the shopkeeper with it, or that word travels fast underground and now the union of all that same man are armed for bear and out for their blood, or that bombing a turkey cooks it perfectly. Spelunky 2 does everything perfect, changed my mind. Now, we've already seen Visceral use interesting ways to confirm that the player understands something important, and there are a lot of ways to do this. Or not at all. That Super Metroid gives the player no option but to use the mechanic to progress, while 2 Human throws info at the player and basically tells them to do their own practice and learn more in the Controls tab. Dead Space 2 puts us in a room where we find this poor lad who was undergoing some sort of open chest surgery when the outbreak began. When Isaac begins to cut the guy out, a necromorph comes in and just disrespects the guy. As the player now finally has a weapon, the first thing they'll likely do is shoot the head, something they've been conditioned to do by other shooters. A very troubling standard to teach children. This cup is empty. But headshots don't work because necromorphs are reanimated corpses that don't rely on things like a nervous system or even face skin, so removing the limbs is a more effective strategy than the head or body. So how do you communicate this without saying, hey, shoot the limbs? Well, when the head is removed, enemies start this I'm gonna wildly swing around and if you get hit it's your own fault routine, making it likely the player will still hit their arms regardless of intention or understanding. But this wasn't good enough, so they halt the player's forward progression with a controlled environment to allow them to learn without the distraction of enemies trying to puncture their sternums. And if it wasn't clear at this point, a lady calls Isaac and explains it outright. This is the premise of the game. A pretty cool one. And they had the restraint to keep it to themselves for 20 minutes. Although they have been demonstrating this and even showing some fun little hints How cool is that? Our next major teaching moment comes when obtaining stasis, an ability that slows enemies down, allowing you to dismember them at your leisure. As the player enters this room, they'll find a door that's just too fast, and as they hack away at this panel, it triggers an enemy that gets hit with stasis as they're given the prompt for how to use it. Ooh. While the first moment had us demonstrate our understanding before the practical exam, this moment, similar to the plasma cutter scene, has the demonstration after. Oh! This is most likely because they needed to teach the player these mechanics in context of combat where it's possible that they wouldn't use it, so they implemented a more controlled way to guarantee the player understood. Oh, a few minutes later, Isaac walks into a room right as it depressurizes, and the game doesn't tell you how to stop it. They just assume the player will want to shoot the big glowing button. This is called, hey, look at this. But some people call it visual hierarchy, a design theory that aims at guiding the viewer's attention using color, contrast, and body parts. I feel unsafe here. It's part of a broader design theory called visual clarity, which in this context allows developers of all game styles to imply how things work without words. Whether you're new to gaming or not, quickly closing walls read as something to avoid and large red pillows read as something to jump on. We pick up on these things whether we realize it or not. This is also another controlled environment to give the player a chance to understand something that will happen naturally throughout the game, combined of course with the known gaming convention of shooting red things. That's orange, and old Mitch show was better. And finally, the player encounters their first boss fight. These are a really great way for developers to really test out what the players learned so far, or perhaps they're given something just for the fight. Or maybe you can just shoot him in the face with a rocket launcher. There are no wrong answers. Here, it's the former, where the player will have to use stasis, shoot the man that is also a limb, and remember that some things aren't as dead as we'd like them to be, unlike that fly from earlier. A while later, after walking down this corridor, the player's attention is directed to a new enemy by an audio cue. Hello? Similar to the medical theater scene and the opening chaotic mess, Visceral is very specific about the amount of time the player has to react to enemies. So here, in an unpanicked state with what we know about visual hierarchy, they are likely to hit the glowing sack, thank you. Then they send two at a time close enough that the player will see that the explosion affects other enemies, and of course Dead Space 2 wouldn't be complete without that stressful test. Knowing that an experienced player would use these explosions to their advantage as they do in other games, Visceral sometimes shakes things up, like in this moment where the player is ambushed. Now whether it's a panic state or not, we know what the player is about to shoot. But this is actually classic misdirection, and there was an airlock there the whole time! While editing this video, I was wondering why this motion was so janky, and then I noticed the camera moves like 12 times in 12 frames, which is a pretty cool little side note. Subscribe for more. And my final example is after a wicked ride on the craziest train imaginable, Isaac's world is flipped turned upside down. Now this is a story all about... Here, the player is expected to use objects with kinesis, slow enemies with stasis, take out exploders at a distance, and flip around to shoot the newly introduced brute enemy in its weak spot, all from a stationary position. I mean, it's pretty cool, I guess. This game does so many things so well. It still has its faults, like how its brilliant intuitive UI is sometimes shoved through the player's abdomen by holding them still to press buttons, but in the category of teaching the player, it is a triumph over its predecessor, which effectively goes through all the same mechanics and ideas, but in less subtle ways. When I started making this video 10 years ago, no seriously, I had intended for it to be just about Dead Space 2, and in the 9.5 years I was not working on it, I had played so many games that featured some of these ideas, but never all of them. And then I found Cocoon. The video's about Cocoon now. This game demonstrates an expert understanding of everything I've brought up in this video so far, and more things I didn't know I needed. Cocoon is a wild puzzle game that introduces the player to its characters, world, controls, and mechanics without a voiceover, words on the screen, or even button prompts. Yeah, it's basically learning through gameplay the game, and I love it. The The game has the player explore what appears to be the remnants of a once great civilization, traversing levels with ancient, tactile, and often goopy technology. Everything in the game is up to the player's perception. What is or was this place, and what is my part in it, are questions the player gets to ask themselves. Or not. The player-controlled beetle uses only one button, is moved with the left analog stick, and the camera is automated, making the control experience as bare bones as possible. When moving near or over an interactable element, the beetle will physically react to it, and because there's only one button for the whole game, they don't explain that either. Quite quickly, the player will figure out that everything they do is done by pressing A, but for symbols like these, the player has to hold the button, so they put the first one on an elevator to really sell it. Ooh. Okay. Ooh. Okay, for real this time. Ooh-ha! That was really nice. Each mechanic is introduced in a simple, focused moment, connecting cause with effect that is then combined with another mechanic in a slick and stylish manner. Some sections require the player to hit these symbols in a specific order with the solution located nearby, but for the first one it can be completed in any order so the player is more focused on the mechanic itself. Certain areas are blocked by pillars which require these little drone dudes that are basically the personification of visual clarity. It even guides the player to the objective without a minimap or obnoxious voiceover before sacrificing itself for you. The only combat in the game is done in boss fights, which introduce a new mechanic specific to that boss that is then expanded upon throughout the fight. But once the player gets these orbs is where the game really starts to reveal its true self, as each of these orbs has its own ability and a world inside of it the player brings other orbs into. The game just keeps amping these ideas up until it had me saying, I don't know how I just solved that, but I had a really good time doing it. Sometimes I'd be walking around with all my orbs in one orb and I'd say to myself, I have everything I need right here. Could a man be happier? It's also so polished that despite it being an insect-related game, I found no bugs in it. Where are you coming from? If you really like the ideas I brought up today, play Cocoon. As a player or a developer, it will fill the gaps this video definitely has. If learning through gameplay is the thesis, and Crackdown 2 is the antithesis, then Cocoon is the synthesis. The resolution to an idea I have been obsessed with since this guy said stuff about video games. Now watch this dunk. Oh my god, the crowd goes wild! There are as many ways to teach a player as there are games. Some games have ideas too complicated to explain without words, or even maybe reading the rules is an active part of the game. Some keep information from the player on purpose to create a specific feeling or atmosphere, and others have wrapped their gameplay up in the narrative. One size does not fit all. All of these games can still benefit from some of none of all of these things I've brought up, and more, or less. Teaching a player how to play your game is as important as the game's design itself, and if you're really good at it, they're the same thing. Thanks for watching.
Press the X button to select. Press the triangle button to exit. Once you get all three numbers correct, they'll flash green. If you fail, they'll flash red. You can always try again.
Got it.